Welcome to the Friday session of the 2020 Religious Freedom Annual Review, a program sponsored by the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. My name is Gary Doxey, and I'm an Associate Director of that center. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Governor Michael O. Leavitt, former United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mike Leavitt served as governor of Utah for 3 terms, from 1993 to 2003. He subsequently held 2 positions in the cabinet of President George W. Bush, first as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and then as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In the latter role, Governor Leavitt brought to bear not only his many years of leadership in government, but also his decades of experience as an insurance executive and business leader. He's the founder and general partner of Leavitt Partners, which is a family of businesses providing clients with investment support, data and analytics, member-based alliances, and other services to help them adopt successful strategies in the complex field of healthcare and other sectors of the economy. I had the personal honor of working with Mike Leavitt as his general counsel during his service as governor of Utah. During that time, I came to cherish his friendship and appreciate his personal integrity and goodness. He is that rare public servant who is interested in results and doesn't really care who gets the credit. I don't know that I've ever met anyone quite so forward-thinking and dynamic. He has an uncanny ability to see a problem and quickly identify the key points on which the solution turns. Like a chess master, he seems to be able to think several moves ahead to identify probable future outcomes of present-day policy decisions. He leans intelligently into the future to leverage emerging developments and opportunities like few others. Mike Leavitt is a noted author and routinely appears as an opinion leader in TV and print media. He grew up in Cedar City, Utah, the oldest of 6 sons. He and his wife, Jackie, have a beautiful family of 5 children and 15 grandchildren. It will now be our privilege to hear from Governor Mike Leavitt.
Well, thank you, Gary. A number of years ago, I was invited by a global corporation to participate in a day-long meeting. The subject was the future. It was attended by leading economists and futurists and a handful of corporate leaders. Candidly, I felt a little awkward even being there. The meeting was held on the top floor of a building overlooking New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty was in the distance. The moderator started the meeting by describing a hypothetical scenario. Pretend, he said, that the year is 2015. This was in 1999. He said, think as though you're looking back over the last 15 years. What would the most surprising thing be that happened during that period of time? Well, one of the participants began to respond with some smart thoughts about the future. A banker spoke of the paperless currency systems that would begin to emerge. An oil executive talked about tensions in the Middle East. A technologist began to talk about faraway reaches of digitalization. Well, I think you know the feeling. You can feel it getting closer and closer to you. I was feeling this growing pressure that I needed something that was cogent to say. But in the final analysis, as it got closer, diversion seemed like the best strategy for me in that setting. So I said this: since we're all reflecting on the future, I'm going to tell you who won the 2015 Nobel Prize in economics. However, the big surprise isn't who won. The big surprise is that the Nobel Prize in economics was won by an economist. It was won by not won by an economist. It was won by a sociologist who advanced a new economic theory called the economics of goodness. It's a simple but a powerful idea. Every nation or state has economic assets that produce wealth. It may be minerals, it may be a seaport, it could be a favorable climate. But there's a universal asset, according to this economics of goodness, that has immense value, and it's inherent in any community that will use it. It's the power to simply do the right thing voluntarily. Let me illustrate, I said. Imagine the economic heft of a nation or a state or a community that was free of drug or substance abuse. Healthcare costs would plummet. Worker productivity would skyrocket. Families that had been torn apart by abuse and financial hardship, wrought by substance abuse, would remain together. Social welfare rolls would fall. There would be fewer children that needed protective care. There'd be less violence. Society would build and maintain fewer prisons. Imagine the power of a nation that was able to invest all of those resources in education or investment or in research. Such a place would prosper. For a moment, there was silence, and then a surprise. One of the participants, that I'll call Professor Cynical, practically shouted at me. "What do you mean by goodness?" he said. "You're turning this into some kind of a religious discussion." Before I could respond, a very well-known economist beat me to it. "Not true," he said. "I'm an atheist, and this isn't about religion. It's about human behavior and the predictability of its consequences. People who work hard do better than slackers. Those that are honest get in less trouble than those who cheat. People who are kind have more friends than those who are cruel. Communities where people serve one another and care for each other are safer than those where that's not true." I have to say that may be the first time I ever said amen to an atheist. But the economics of goodness applies to individuals as well as nations. People who work hard, those who are honest and reliable, have a better chance at success than those that don't. Now, there's an interesting postscript to this story. As I said, that happened in 1999. When it got to be 2015, I got thinking, I wonder who it is that actually won the Nobel Prize in 2015. Well, it turns out it wasn't a sociologist. I got that wrong. Nor was it awarded for the economics of goodness. The prize was awarded to an esteemed Princeton economist, Angus Deaton. However, his contribution is certainly in the neighborhood. Dr. Deaton was recognized with the Nobel for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. In essence, Dr. Deaton was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for demonstrating empirically that human behavior and economics are linked. The economics of goodness is not a new idea, and it is not simply about money. Willingly doing the right thing produces superior outcomes. Currently, communities throughout the world are struggling to prevail over COVID-19. We're all learning about pandemic disease. The subject is not so new to me. Unexpectedly in my life, the subject of pandemics played an important role in my career. About 4 months after my service as the Secretary of Health in the United States, I was invited to attend an emergency meeting with the Centers for Disease Control, the agency within the United States that tracks infectious disease. It was explained to me that scientists around the world were concerned about the emergence of an influenza virus with what they referred to as pandemic potential. The scientific name was H5N1. They explained that the virus was actually carried by birds and that it had mutated sufficiently that this bird virus had now infected people. 60% of the people who got the virus died. And the worry they had was that the virus might mutate further and begin to transmit itself from person to person instead of just bird to person. And when that happened, if it went person to person, it would qualify as a pandemic because it would clearly, in its form, spread across the earth. Well, before that meeting, I have to say, I'm not sure I had given the idea of pandemic disease much thought. And my questions to them that day might have reflected that. Because the next morning, a young colleague of mine came in to my office carrying a book named The Great Influenza, a history of pandemic disease, and particularly the history of the pandemic of 1918. As he set it on my desk, he said, "You need to understand this." The following weekend, I began to read the book. It detailed the history of the last pandemic that was anywhere near the scale of what we're dealing with COVID-19. Reading the book generated in me an awareness of disease and what a profound shaper of history it is. At that time, it was my job to assess the readiness of the United States in such a situation. And as I sought to understand that, it was clear to me that the United States was not prepared, nor were any other countries around the world. As this H5N1 virus continued to spread, our government appropriated billions of dollars, and I spent much of the next 3 years leading a focused effort to develop a pandemic response plan. Fortunately, the H5N1 virus did not become a pandemic, but the experience caused me to study pandemics throughout history. And I became intimately acquainted with the way pandemics unfold and the way they reshape the economies and the sociology and even the politics of the world, something that we're now all experiencing firsthand. Well, while there were many similarities to COVID-19 and other world-changing pandemics in the past, one difference that we should all recognize is the existence of the communication technology that we have today. In 1918, the last global pandemic of this proportion, the world did not have the capacity to communicate instantly like we do today. Consequently, there has never been a civilization as capable of taking action during a pandemic as the one that we live in. For at least the last century, the idea that we would practice what we now all know to be social distancing has been a well-established practice in preventing the spread of disease. But modern communication has allowed countries all over the world to deploy this social distancing at a scale that has never been undertaken before. Across the world, countries have gone into a condition ranging from lockdown to simple isolation. Schools have been closed, churches, businesses, and governments have been shut down. Travel has been stopped, traditions have been aside, not just for a few days, but for months. What has occurred is unprecedented in health history. Nations did this because history had taught them that if they allowed the spread of this virus to happen in an uninterrupted way, the virus would take hundreds of millions of lives across the globe. And while there's hope and optimism, modern science will develop a vaccine or other medical solutions right now. This social distancing that we're all practicing by virtue of our being in this holding this meeting the way we are today, this is the only medical intervention that we have. Now, the good news is it appears that our social distancing tactics are effective. While still devastating, millions of lives have likely been saved by this quite remarkable and unprecedented action. The hard news is the medical intervention, as I referred to it, we call social distancing, is like most medical interventions. It has side effects. Most medical interventions have side effects. Like most of you, I know someone who has a chronic condition that creates a lot of pain. Their doctor has provided a medical intervention, medicine for the pain. But the medicine came with a warning. Use this too long or use too much of it. There can be side effects that have the potential to be equally harmful to the condition that we're treating. The cost could be just as high, but in a different way. In other words, there's a limit to how much of this you can use. While COVID-19 is a medical or is a chronic situation, social distancing then is the equivalent of a medical intervention. And like other medical interventions, it has to come with a warning. You can only do this so long, or you can only use it so much, because the side effects can be harmful, just like the virus, but in a different way. Well, we all are living the side effects of this social distancing that we're having now. Millions of jobs have been lost. Economies have plummeted. Months of isolation have started to take a psychological toll on people and their families. Food supplies in our just-in-time economy have begun to fray. And we all feel this. While we're grateful for the technology that allows us to come together like this, we're getting Zoom fatigue. It's particularly true for those who are most vulnerable. I have parents who are squarely in the population that we all know now to be most at risk. My father's 91, my mother is 88. And while they both have health limitations, they're able to live a full and fulfilling life, very active lives. But as a family, we've done all we can to protect them. I've become what they refer to as the social distancing police. It's because I love them. It's because I want them to be safe. But the side effects are taking over. They're a little tired of this. My father called me on the phone. Mike, he said, I just want you to know I swam the moat. He didn't have to explain. I knew exactly what he meant. He couldn't take it anymore, and he had left the house. I knew exactly what he meant. Now it's okay because he was just going to the office. He wanted to just have a little bit change in scene, but it was a symbol to me. We're all feeling like we want to swim the moat. But this coronavirus is still with us, and COVID-19 is still a grave threat. As countries all over the world open up, it's clear that that biology is still going to play out, and we're only at the beginning of this. It's very likely that we'll begin and continue to see flare-ups, and flare-ups that'll become hotspots. It's a reminder that most pandemics have a second or a third wave that is even more virulent than the first. So we have this dilemma. The medical intervention that we have and have practiced before and worked has side effects. And those side effects have been devastating. And most people just don't see how we can lock down like we did before. So we're in this period where we're trying to rebalance how much of this group behavior that we practiced can continue. We're trying to learn what we can do safely and what we can't. I've had the experience of trying to walk across a frozen lake. I recall having stepped onto the ice, not knowing how thin or thick the ice was, walked a few steps and listened for cracking sounds. When I couldn't hear it, I moved forward. We're all going through the health equivalent of that right now. A political debate has emerged between those who support opening up and those that would be more restrained. It's happening in every jurisdiction, in every country throughout the world in one form or another. people see this differently. They have different priorities. They have different circumstances. They have different risk tolerance for risk. A person who's 90 and has a lung condition sees it much differently than a 25-year-old. This demonstrates why it is difficult in many jurisdictions for this to simply be a one-size-fits-all approach, and brings some question as to the degree to which governments can practice these large group behaviors that we have in the past in the future. So we're at an inflection point in this pandemic. Up to this point, our medical countermeasures have been group behaviors, to a large degree orchestrated by government action. Businesses, schools, and churches, as I've said, have closed. Travel's been stopped. Events have been canceled. These are all group behaviors. We're moving rapidly now into a period where these group behaviors are going to be less possible to sustain. A combination of economic limits and human impatience, as I've spoken of, will begin to limit them. We're now beginning to rely less on group behaviors to combat this and more on individual behaviors. I'm talking about whether people are willing to comport to a handful of very simple behaviors that we've all learned before. Behaviors very simple, like washing our hands, etc. These are simple things that will create an ability for us to be safe. And we have the ability to communicate them widely and ubiquitously, a capacity that wasn't there before. So will we wash our hands frequently? Are we willing to stand at a distance and limit our interactions as much as possible? We now know much more about the way the virus is spread. Are we willing to wear a face covering in certain situations? We will individually and collectively begin to govern our activities in ways that will produce good outcomes. That's the question, will we? So it's clear that individuals and families and communities and nations that succeed at these practices will have better outcomes than those that don't. These outcomes will be reflected in their health, in their happiness, and yes, in their economic well-being. The economics of goodness will play out here too. Now, this conference is a review of the status of religious freedom around the world. It would be important for me to provide a reminder that governments are designed in a way as to compel group behaviors. Whether in the case of a pandemic or any other human endeavor, the use of secular laws to change individual behaviors will always have side effects, unintended consequences. Governments change behavior by edict. As a friend of mine recently reminded me, behind every law, there's a person with a gun. Communities of faith, however, attempt to change behavior by changing hearts. When a heart changes, nations change. While a nation may be defined by geographic borders, it is measured by the aggregation of what's in people's hearts. The COVID-19 pandemic, like other pandemics, has revealed some of our civilization's greatest flaws. It's created an awareness of social inequities that exist. The suffering and death that's disproportionately been present is based often on economic status or on race. This is not a physiological phenomenon, it's a sociological phenomenon. COVID-19 is affecting these cohorts differently because they have less availability to healthcare and nutrition. In recent days, we've seen sad examples of where the force of law has been used in ways that are simply wrong. Once again, there are evident racial minorities that are falling victim in vast disproportion. We see inequities and hardship inflicted upon LGBT communities. These are events that simply reflect on us as a society. We have to ask, are these events that are simply a reflection of institutions that have gone wrong, or does it reflect a flaw in our collective character? These events have caused me to reflect on the status of my heart, and I suspect it has yours as well. But how do we fix these things? Is there a need for government action? Yes. But governments have not proven particularly good at repairing character or changing individual behaviors. Reshaping character is about changing hearts. As a public official, it became very clear to me that people respond more rapidly to requests and to suggestions from those to whom they pay devotion, tithes, and offerings than entities who demand their taxes. Governments are increasingly willing to adopt laws that either deliberately limit religious freedom or create a side effect with the same outcome. The economics of goodness will exact a profound price when this occurs. Those who attend this meeting are guardians of religious freedom around the world, and I thank you for that. May I say in conclusion, let us all keep that stewardship. Our aspiration for a healthy and prosperous society depends on it. Thank you.
The 2019 annual report of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies is entitled Field Makers. 20 years ago, when the center was founded, the field of international law and religion was in its infancy. The field has since come into its own, thanks to certain field makers. It is my pleasure today to introduce two of those field makers, Professor Elizabeth Clark and Professor Brett Scharffs. Professor Clark is an Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. She has written and edited numerous books and articles on both comparative and U.S. law and religion issues. She has also participated heavily in law reform efforts, drafting analyses of pending legislation around the world, as well as amicus briefs before the United States Supreme Court. In addition, she has testified on religious freedom issues before the U.S. Congress. Before joining BYU Law School, Professor Clark practiced in the appellate and Supreme Court litigation group at Meyer, Brown & Platt in Washington, D.C., and clerked for Judge J. Clifford Wallace on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She graduated summa cum laude from BYU Law School, where she was editor-in-chief of the BYU Law Review. Professor Clark and I became friends in law school. I can attest that in addition to her impressive academic expertise and practical impact, she is truly a wonderful person. We look forward to her remarks. After Professor Clark speaks, we will hear from another friend and field maker, Professor Brett Scharffs. Professor Scharffs holds the Rex E. Lee Chair on the law faculty at Brigham Young University. He is also the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Professor Scharff received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Philosophy from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He graduated from Yale Law School, having served as senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. Professor Scharffs is the author of more than 100 articles and book chapters. His casebook, Law and Religion, National, International, and Comparative Perspectives, which he co-authored with Professor Cole Durham, has been translated into multiple languages. He and Professor Clark co-authored Religion and Law in the United States of America, part of Walter Kluwer's International Encyclopedia of Laws. Professor Scharffs regularly teaches abroad on issues of religious freedom. Professor Scharffs and I served together as Associate Deans of the BYU Law School. I now have the privilege to serve under his able leadership at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. He is a talented and caring individual, a visionary leader, and a good friend. Thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. Professor Clark.
Community and hope seem to be in short supply these days. Initial bursts of national unity in response to COVID-19 outbreaks in the US have seriously frayed, revealing for many how splintered America was even before the pandemic. Self-isolation and social distancing tear at the heart of community. Is a meaningful community even possible when we're unable to be there for each other at book clubs, weddings, or even funerals? Hope for many also feels out of reach. As of the end of May, over 100,000 Americans have died from COVID-19, more than in the Vietnam War. A staggering 1/3 of Americans have experienced high levels of psychological distress during the crisis. Over 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits, the most since the Great Depression, and over about a quarter of the pre-COVID-19 workforce. Many who still do work have positions where they're vulnerable to COVID-19 exposure, and yet others struggle with disabilities or family situations that exacerbate the effect of the crisis. And certainly African Americans, Native Americans, and other minority groups have also been disproportionately affected. The uncertainties inherent in a new pandemic can feel overwhelming. When will life return to normal? Will the new normal even resemble the way we used to live? How and when can we return to communal religious and social life and more regular economic life without unduly endangering vulnerable populations? Just recounting the problems is discouraging. No wonder hope seems often so fleeting. In developing the subtitle for this conference, Finding Community and Hope, I initially thought of how religious communities bring a sense of unity and hope to their members in times of crisis. But on reflection, I've realized these gifts from religious practice and belief aren't limited just to members of religious communities. A wide variety of researchers have noted religion's significant contributions to civic life, mental health, family and social stability, care for the poor, and community service and volunteerism. The columnist George Will, who describes himself as a, quote, amiable, low-voltage atheist, has argued, quote, even those of us who are members of the growing cohort that the Pew Survey calls nuns, N-O-N-E-S, even we, perhaps especially we, should wish for the continued vigor of the rich array of religious institutions that have leavened American life, unquote. The richness of religious experience and tradition brings some unique insights to bear as we seek to respond to and emerge from this current crisis. But before that, I'd like to relate a short story that should resonate with all of us who've spent significant time in our homes in the last few months. In The Bet, Anton Chekhov tells how a banker and a young lawyer make a bet that the lawyer can stay in isolation for 15 years to the day. He's free to leave anytime, but if he leaves early, he fails to get the promised $2 million. As the story tells it, quote, it was agreed that for 15 years, he should not be free to cross the threshold of the lodge, to see human beings, to hear the human voice, or to receive letters and newspapers. By the terms of the agreement, the only relations he could have with the outer world were by a little window made purposely for that object. He might have anything he wanted, books, music, wine, and so on, in any quantity desired by writing an order, but could only receive them through the window. The 19th century version of online shopping. The first year, the lawyer, quote, suffered severely from loneliness and depression. The books he sent for were principally of a light character, novels with complicated love plot, sensational and fantastic stories, so on. In other words, binging on Tiger King. The lawyer then spends years cycling through reading classics, laying on his bed doing nothing but eating and drinking, playing music, studying foreign languages. Then, after the 10th year, the prisoner sat immovably at the table and read nothing but the gospel. It seemed strange to the banker that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 learned volumes should waste nearly a year over one thin book of easy of comprehension. Theology and histories of religion followed the Gospels. In the final 5 years, the lawyer in solitary confinement seeks to learn broadly and intensively, reading Shakespeare, chemistry, philosophy, and more theology. As the 15 years are about to expire, the banker, who at this point has lost his money in wild speculations, decides to kill the lawyer to avoid paying out on the bet. The night before the bet is to be fulfilled, the banker comes into the lodge where the lawyer is staying. He creeps in and finds the man, looking aged and pale with long hair and a shaggy beard. Sounds familiar? The lawyer is asleep, but the banker reads the note he's written. The lawyer explains that after 15 years of studying earthly life, he realizes that others have, quote, lost their reason and taken the wrong path. He writes, I marvel at you who exchanged heaven for earth, and that, quote, to prove to you in action that I despise all you live by, I renounce the 2 million of which I once dreamed of as paradise and which I now despise. To deprive myself of the right to the money, I shall go out from here 5 hours before the time fixed, and so break the compact. When the banker had read this, he laid the page on the table, kissed the strange man on his head, and went out of the lodge weeping. When he hears the next day that the lawyer indeed left the house and broke the bet, the banker takes the lawyer's note and locks it in his safe. It's a thought-provoking story. I first read it over 25 years ago, and it stayed with me. To me, in mid-2020, though, the story prompts the question of how do we let deprivation and loss change us? We've all faced loss in recent months. Loss of loved ones, loss of employment, loss of dreams, loss of hope and community. Can something come from this beyond the very real pain and grief we've all been experiencing? Can the loss somehow be transformative? How? I think it's no surprise that over the past few months, international religious leaders, including President Russell M. Nelson of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Pope Francis, and Muslim leaders from the United Arab Emirates have called for worldwide interfaith fasting and prayers. Now, fasting is a practice that cuts across a wide variety of religious traditions, a self-imposed smaller loss mirroring larger ones. While the significance and details of fasting varies from tradition to tradition, it's often connected to drawing closer to the divine, revelation, change and repentance, and care for the poor, in short, with loss and transformation. Muslims worldwide, for example, recently completed Ramadan, a month of fasting from dawn to dusk. They focus on their connection to God and families, and by tradition are especially generous to the poor. I recently heard a Muslim intellectual also describe this as a time of revelation, recalling when Muhammad went into the caves and received the Quran. Jews celebrate Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year, by fasting. This is a day of repentance, of recognizing guilt. But as Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik has commented, this is actually a hopeful doctrine because, quote, there's no guilt without freedom. The very freedom that allows for guilt allows for change, for improvement. Now, many Christians, in memory of Christ's 40 days of fasting in the wilderness, celebrate a period of fasting of Lent, between Ash Wednesday and Easter. Pope Francis said Lent is a fitting time for self-denial. We do well to ask ourselves what we can give up in order to help and enrich others by our own poverty. Let us not forget that real poverty hurts. No self-denial is real without this dimension of penance. I distrust a charity that costs nothing and does not hurt, end quote. Now, this only scratches the surface of understandings of fastings in these and other religious traditions. But there's a pattern here that weaves across traditions. This period of loss and denial becomes sacred and transformative as those who fast look upward to the divine, move forward with hope, and then reach outward with love. Fasting for the religious is not merely celebrating hunger or some twisted love of misery. It's profoundly counterintuitive in the way that religious logic often is, right? We forego necessities in order to gain something better. We abase ourselves in order to become holier. We lose ourselves in order to lose our lives in order to save them. The loss that is fasting becomes holy as those fasting seek revelation and transformation during the fast, and then go forward with confidence and inspiration to bless others throughout the world. Now, as I compare this kind of consecrated fasting with how we can respond to COVID-19 pandemic, let me be clear from the outset. I don't want to tell any one of you what you should be experiencing or how you should be processing your loss and grief. I love the quote, Nothing is more barren to one in agony than pat answers which seem the unfeeling evasion of a distant spectator who never felt a wound. My point is not to offer pat answers. What I wish is that I could offer a hug to those of you who are struggling today. I'd sit and listen to you, and cry with you, and mourn with you. But my point today is that there are resources available when we feel able to turn to them. Regardless of one's faith or lack thereof, the reservoirs of our community's faith traditions are sources we can all draw from. This is why I care about religious freedom. I believe deeply that it's a public good belonging to believers and unbelievers, the faithful and the undecided. Not only does it give us all space to make decisions freely about the things that matter most in life and then live out those beliefs, but it also allows for the preservation of institutions and traditions that bless people of all faiths and no faith. As I conclude, may I suggest that like the transformative isolation of the lawyer in the bed, or the experience of believers in fasting, our national experience with the pandemic can also turn us upward, move us forward, and cause us to reach outward. Turning upwards, we can become people who care more deeply about things that are most important, valuing loving family relationships, time and nature, opportunities to learn and grow, fairness and justice for others. As a society, we can value civility, kindness, and decency. We can choose to prioritize working together to solve the difficult problems we all face. We can move forward from the deprivation of the pandemic with hope and confidence instead of fear, trusting in the goodness of others and of God, supporting the best efforts of scientists, medical professionals, public health experts, and political leaders to work together civilly to hammer out reasonable solutions as the situation continues to develop. We can have confidence that working together, we can overcome this challenge as we have others in our nation's history. Finally, the loss we've experienced can cause us to reach outwards, seeking to improve the lives of others, particularly the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. As a national community, we also have a striking opportunity to seek revelation and insight on how we can transform for the better. Experts and pundits are already commenting on how society will change as a result of the COVID-19 crisis in fields such as healthcare, family life, environment, technology, education. We can and should be part of this discussion. But each of us can also seek individual revelation and inspiration on how the crisis should change us. Will it change how we relate to and serve others in our family? Will it change our political discourse and priorities? Will it change how we use our time and resources? The COVID pandemic may be the end of the old normal and the loss of the familiar world we knew. But endings and loss provide unique opportunities for transformations and improvement. My hope is that as a nation and as individuals, we can turn upwards with faith, move forwards with hope, and reach outwards to others with pure love, building strong communities as we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Leavitt and Professor Clark. We appreciate your messages. As I've noted elsewhere, I've been thinking of the current coronavirus pandemic as presenting a kind of stress test upon us and upon the institutions to which we belong. Perhaps you remember an engineering contest common in high school, when you were tasked with making a bridge out of balsa wood and glue. With a few basic parameters, we built our bridges, which were then tested to see how much weight they could bear before breaking under the strain. My bridge, as I recall, was neither particularly beautiful nor particularly robust. Another form of stress test measures how well our hearts work during physical exercise, which becomes increasingly strenuous. As we strive to practice responsible physical distancing, this is surely a time that is testing the strength and resilience of the bridges that connect us one with another, a time that is trying our hearts. To shift metaphors, in recent weeks, I have felt as if we find ourselves balanced on a razor's edge, with despair lying on one side and rage on the other. We are already seeing evidence that the toll on mental and emotional health, as well as the economic toll that this crisis is exacting, will be significant, alongside the more obvious public health toll, not to mention the terrible price that the coronavirus has exacted on more than 100,000 individuals and their families here in the United States, and many multiples of that number around the world. As the health and economic crisis is compounded with racial tension, we have a sense that today we're facing 3 generational challenges all at once. Today, I'd like to discuss several strategies, some legal, some not, that may help us withstand the stresses we are currently experiencing. I'll begin with one preliminary observation, followed by 3 legal strategies and 3 non-legal strategies for responding to the COVID crisis. First, the preliminary point. Religion and religious exercise are not beyond or outside the law. We must not imagine ourselves to be or to act as outlaws. There is no blanket exemption from legal oversight for religious exercise, nor sweeping immunity from state authority. When we speak of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, we are not talking about absolute rights. Fundamental, yes. Absolute, no. More than a century ago, in a 1905 case, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the argument of a pastor from Massachusetts who objected on religious grounds from compulsory vaccination against smallpox. As the Supreme Court recently reminded us in a case involving a church in California, today, too, religious organizations and religious individuals will be subject to emergency measures that place significant limits on religious exercise. At times of crisis, it is perhaps natural to look for new and innovative ways of responding. And in finding solutions to COVID-19, we do need innovation, including in finding treatments and ultimately a vaccination to prevent infections. But in the case of freedom of religion in the COVID-19 era, what is remarkable is how ready, responsive, and resilient are the legal tools in our existing toolkit. We've dealt with crises before, including pandemics, and we have the legal tools needed to address the challenges we are facing now. We need to remember what those tools are and how to use them. These are important not just for judges, but for everyone who exercises and executes the law, as well as for us as citizens. I will mention 3. First, the basic baseline principles are the rule of law and non-discrimination. Religious activity cannot simply be completely banned. Governors who have taken the view that religious activity is not essential and can simply be prohibited are mistaken, and courts will strike down comprehensive measures that prohibit all religious activity. Religious freedom, including religious worship and the right to gather, are among our most precious and protected constitutional rights. The rule of law includes the requirement that the coercive legal power of the state be enacted and exercised in accordance with the rules stipulated for lawmaking and the exercise of executive and police authority. In an emergency, it is easy for government officials to overstep the bounds of their authority and to issue sweeping proclamations that may not satisfy minimal rule of law requirements. More problematic, measures that are implemented at times of emergency too easily become permanent limitations on freedom that outlast the emergency. The principle of non-discrimination is a basic baseline requirement that the free exercise of religion, including activities and manifestations of religion, not be treated less favorably than similarly situated activities. To my mind, a close comparison is how states regulate health clubs and fitness centers. Like churches, these are places where people gather in close proximity, touch shared equipment and devices, and where the prospect of particles of saliva in the air is not only possible, but probable. Another close analogy is the treatment of gatherings for concerts or the theater. Given the free exercise clause, there may be good constitutional reasons for allowing religious gatherings to happen before health clubs or movie theaters are permitted to reopen. But it is difficult to imagine legitimate reasons for allowing these gatherings while prohibiting religious services of a similar size. It is also interesting to compare media, social media, and public responses to contagion clusters or hotspots that emerge in these different settings. Too often, both in the US and beyond, a cluster linked to a religious community, especially if it is a minority group, such as Orthodox Jews in New York, or a small new religious movement in South Korea, are treated as especially dangerous and even pathological. But similar clusters that emerge from a health club, a bar, or a nightclub are treated as unfortunate and ordinary public health events to be managed sensibly. A second important legal principle, which we might think of as an intermediate strategy, is the concept of reasonable accommodation. In many areas of the law, including the free exercise of religion, legislation often mandates that reasonable accommodations be made for special needs of groups or individuals. Examples here might include special needs relating to diet, religious attire, or religious holidays or rituals. As we emerge from this crisis, there will be a number of situations that call out for reasonable accommodation, such as access of patients in hospitals to religious leaders, including chaplains, or the performance of rituals that require proximity and touching. Think here of last rites for a Catholic who is dying, or a baptism, or an ordinance that requires the laying on of hands. It will be reasonable to require those participating in such activities to observe certain restraints, often in the form of guidelines, and a measure of trust between religious and government officials will be necessary, much as it is in other essential activities that are permitted. I've written about 3 different attitudes that we sometimes take to the concept of reasonable accommodation. The first is to treat special needs as unfortunate exceptions to general and neutral rules that should be granted at best reluctantly, ostensibly because they violate the principle of equal treatment. The second is to view reasonable accommodations as modifications or adjustments that must be made by those who would prefer to observe religious precepts or follow the dictates of their conscience. Here, the party that must make the accommodation is the person who is required to depart from their convictions. But there is a third, and to my mind, much more attractive way of thinking about accommodations, and it is based on the idea of a hotel or guest house that is provided as a place of sanctuary and abode for the weary traveler. When a stranger arrives, it is possible to turn them away on the grounds that there is no room for them in the inn. But it is also possible to give them a place where they can safely rest their head. We can provide them an accommodation. This attitude towards accommodation reflects what we might call an ethic of hospitality rather than an ethic of right. As we emerge from the COVID crisis, it will be interesting to see which of these 3 attitudes prevails. Will we look at religious needs as unfortunate exceptions, as sacrifices that must be made by the observant, or as opportunities to accommodate, to provide an accommodation for others, including those who may be different or even seem alien? A third legal principle that is an important part of our legal toolkit for responding to the COVID crisis is the compelling state interest test, which requires that governments use the least restrictive means when limiting religious freedom. The basic idea is that restrictions or limitations on religious activities or manifestations should be no greater than what is really necessary. This will require careful balancing that takes account of actual circumstances, which may change quickly. In compelling state interest cases, most of the action takes place in the second phase of the analysis. There are two things worth emphasizing. First, it is the government that bears the burden both of establishing that there is a compelling state interest that justifies the limitation, and more importantly, it is the government that bears the burden of proving there is no less restrictive way of protecting that interest. What we find is that governments are good at identifying compelling reasons to limit freedom, but they are less adept at ensuring that their methods are narrowly tailored to vindicate those compelling interests. Now for the non-legal strategies. As a law professor, it is easy for me to make the mistake of focusing exclusively on legal responses to social problems, including the COVID crisis. And as I've suggested, we have powerful and useful tools in our legal toolkit for addressing the challenges at hand. But I've come to believe that as important as jurist-centric approaches are, usually more important are non-jurist-centric approaches. Let me mention three non-legal strategies that may be especially apropos at this time. The first is remembering to exercise patience, forbearance, and restraint, both with ourselves and with each other. Speaking personally, I have found my nerves frayed and my emotions heightened over the past several months. I find especially that I am less tolerant of the behavior of others that is full of regard for self and deficient in regard for others. As a boy, I had a neighbor my age named Mark McKinney, who grew up to be a high school football coach. He died tragically from a congenital condition when he was still in his 30s. But before that, he invited me to attend a football game with his team, which, as I recall, had not won a game all year. I remember vividly the locker room speech he gave to those young men before the game. He emphasized good sportsmanship and the importance of being classy. He used that word with variations over and over. Have class, be classy. Let's be known for sportsmanship and class. What I realized then, and what I've been reminded of recently, is that he was teaching those boys something much more important than how to behave during a football game. This is a lesson I need to remember as well. Second is striving to be a light at times of darkness. I've been impressed with how often in Scripture we are admonished to be a light. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus declares, "Ye are the light of the world." He urges us to not hide our light under a bushel and to let our light shine. We are also taught to recognize Jesus Christ as the light of the world. When we find ourselves incapable of being a light, perhaps we can strive to reflect his light. In John 8:12, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." Finally, if we are so tired or worn down that we cannot be a light or even effectively reflect light, when we find ourselves in darkness, let us be seekers after and believers in the reality of light. As the great Bono of U2 has reminded us, darkness always gathers around the light. But the New Testament prophet John reminds us, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In that song called 13, There is a Light, Bono reminds us that just as we know the world exists, even if we are no longer living, we should not doubt that light exists just because it is dark. If there is a light, we can't always see. If there is a world, we can't always be. If there is a dark, now we shouldn't doubt there is a light. Don't let it go out. Third and finally, for the past several years, we at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies have been participating in a major global initiative focusing on the idea of human dignity for everyone, everywhere. Human dignity is an important legal principle, and it is the foundational idea upon which human rights are based. But recognizing, regarding, and respecting the dignity of all people in all places is also an important strategy for responding, collectively and individually, to the COVID crisis. Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, in his April 2020 General Conference address, A Perfect Brightness of Hope, spoke of the all-hands-on-deck war with COVID-19. Quote, a solemn reminder that a virus 1,000 times smaller than a grain of sand can bring entire populations and global economies to their knees. Elder Holland goes on to speak of the hopes we have as we emerge from this crisis, including the hope, quote, for the gift of personal dignity for every child of God, unmarred by any form of racial, ethnic, or religious prejudice. I might add that in the aftermath of the George Floyd death, this emphasis on overcoming all forms of prejudice resonates especially strongly. Elder Holland goes on to say, undergirding all of this is our relentless hope for greater devotion to the two greatest of all commandments, to love God by keeping his counsel, and to love our neighbors by showing kindness and compassion, patience and forgiveness. These two divine directives are still, and forever will be, the only real hope we have for giving our children a better world than the one they now know. Focusing on human dignity for everyone everywhere is a useful antidote for the tendency to over-politicize the moment in which we find ourselves. In the 2 years I have spent working on the Human Dignity Project, there are two things that stand out most clearly in my mind. The first is the generative character of human dignity. Almost everyone has something interesting and insightful to add to our understanding of this concept, which is at once simple and clear, but which is also rich and thick. Second, human dignity tends to elevate rather than degrade conversations. Most political concepts become divisive quickly. It is possible that human dignity becomes divisive as well. But this idea, human dignity for everyone everywhere, I believe has a greater prospect for elevating our discourse and providing light in a time of darkness than any other comparable concept. This is especially important as we face these three generational crises: the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the crisis of racism and division. In conclusion, as we face the stress test of the COVID crisis, I hope we will remember we are not beyond the law. I also hope we will remember and use in appropriate and perhaps even skillful ways the tools in our legal toolkit, observing the rule of law, following the principles of non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation, and ensuring the limitations on our freedoms, including religious freedom, last no longer and are no greater than necessary, that the restraints are narrowly tailored and represent the least restrictive means of protecting public health and safety. As we think about non-legal responses, I hope we will try to be patient and exercise forbearance and restraint with ourselves and each other. Let us strive to be a light, to reflect and follow our Savior's light, and to seek and believe in the reality of light at times of darkness. May we remember that we are each children of God, created in his image, with all of the dignity, value, and status that implies. Finally, please stay safe and well. Thank you for joining us over the past 3 days for these online discussions of ways of finding community and hope during the COVID era and beyond. I look forward to seeing you next year in person. God bless us, everyone.